All righty. We are back with another episode of the Moby Dick Book Club, continuing to hack our way through the book. Just look at what we've achieved and take heart that it's been good so far. Going 88 to 94. And as always, if you're curious about this, you can join the Discord server. The link is in the description. We are starting off with chapter 88, Schools and Schoolmasters, which I thought was another a very humorous chapter here. Um, Ishmaelville is describing to us the different types of schools of whales here. Apparently, much like fish, they like to band together and keep around. Um, so either you get a group of females, or you'll get a large group of young bulls. Uh, with the groups of females, you might have a big male with a large number of ladies around it. And Ishmael likes to point out over and over again that this is a harem. Uses that term repeatedly and refers to the big male as a ottoman. And then the also there's a phenomenon of the older a whale gets, the more likely it is to be out in the ocean all by itself, that it doesn't congregate anymore. Apparently, when you've got one of these big schools of fish, uh, if you've got one male with a large number of females, there's not much oil in the large male for the whale harvesters to harvest. Um, so they'll go for any of the other whales if that's an option. And the young males tend to like to fight um, the boats that come after them the most, whereas the females are less aggressive. And there was just one particular line that I want to point out here. But if you guys got anything else you want to talk about first, you go ahead. You guys are
No,
both muted, by the way.
yeah, Castle had pre-warned me that this is the amusing section of the book, and indeed, indeed, that is quite correct. I did like the style of these chapters, so that was rather fun.
So Ishmael refers to the one male with a harem around it as an ottoman, and he says, "Our ottoman enters upon the impotent, repentant, admonitionary stage of life, forswears, disbands the harem, and grown to an exemplary, sulky old soul, goes about all alone among the meridians and parallels, saying his prayers, and warning each young leviathan from his amorous errors." And it's like, are we talking about whales here or not? Because that sounds like something else entirely right there.
Yeah, this entire thing was just hilarious commentary, and I mean, just the whole like the Ottoman whales and everything, and the whole like the schoolmaster of like the whale Hefner sort of situation, and oh my goodness, it's just it's so ridiculous, but it's like everything about this was just so, I don't know, just like overly anthropomorphized. That was just like, yeah, it's just we're way beyond yeah, to my sort of title here, like it's not even mammalogy anymore, like it's ishmamology. And yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous, but it's just hilarious to read.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think it's like, it's certainly, some of this stuff is way over the top to try and apply to whales, right? And this particular line that is going around warning other young leviathans from his amorous errors. It's like, no, no, I don't think that's happening. But if you've ever seen like a bunch of 12-year-old boys riding bikes around, you get the sense of what these packs of young bulls is like. Or even if they're a little bit older and a hockey team or something like that. That's like, you do get the sense of that. And especially that one point where he talks about how if one of the whales gets taken out, by a whaler, all of the other whales will just bolt. I think that could happen, even though, like, 4 whales could easily just wipe out an entire whaling expedition. They don't have the capacity to cooperate with each other like that.
Yeah, well, and I think too, I mean, this is a weird chapter because effectively all it's doing is resolving all the problems we've been, quote, struggling with somehow around gender and the difference between men and women, right? Because he splits the world in two. There's female whales and there's male whales, and the males are just huge and the females are a third the size, right? Just like that's just how it is. And if you go after a male whale and you get him, his buddies, they just take off because that's how males are, right? And so it really is just raw social commentary, and you can kind of see, more of this meaning crisis sort of being struggled with and potentially resolved, at least in a whales, right here. And I think that's that to me is what's super interesting, is that the meaning crisis is right here and the resolution is right here in the book. You don't have to go any further. It's all sitting right there for you.
The resolution is for every male to try and acquire a harem, or
no, because that actually doesn't work, right? I mean, that's the other, right? I mean, he's talking about that, like the whales are being preyed upon partially because of this.
Oh, okay. All
It's
right.
not successful, right? I mean, in one way, it's a very Christian critique, right? Like if you're one of these Ottoman,
Sultans.
with a harem, then you're going to get preyed upon by the whales, and your male buddies are just going to take off, right? And the women are going to fecklessly try to defend themselves, right? Because it's a critique of what people have wrongfully, of course, been referring to as toxic masculinity, because that's what it's describing in essence, among other things, and it's doing it cleverly because it's contrasting it with the feminine and the differences between the two, right? Because because I mean, he's established like there's two types and they're different, and here's how they're different. They're physically different. They're different in the way they act. They're different, right? They're different, right? But then, yeah, it's all about the differences between male and female. And yeah, the larger commentary of the book is meaning crisis and how to resolve it, and all the problems that we have come up with, we'll say more recently, are not new, right? We just had good literature to resolve it for us, and now we've got comic books and video games. It'll be great.
Nothing can possibly go wrong.
Never. I just there is this sort of very interesting thing of that, like that no matter what happens, it's the male is just actually not incurring like any penalties aside from just like in his old age he's kind of repenting, but it's like in the one where you've got the schoolmaster one, that one is that he's never hunted, so it's like if anyone gets plucked off from his group, it's always like a female. And then in the dude group, it's like, yeah, there's actually no, there's no sort of camaraderie there. And there's even the line there. It says, no prudent underwriter would insure them any more than he would a riotous lad at Yale or Harvard. It's just like, I love the idea of insuring a whale, but also it's just like, that's where we're for sure nowhere near in the realm of like actually talking about whales. But the thing of like why he calls the one larger, older male the schoolmaster, where he says, it's not in strict character, but and admirably satirical, that after going to school himself, he should then go abroad inculcating not what he learned there, but the folly of it. It's just like, yeah, that's.
And he was making a reference to a particular French guy who was a criminal and then a criminologist. Pay attention to that, huh? I'm not saying that, a former con man might not repent and teach the police how to catch the tricks, but this guy wrote a lot of books, so
I wonder if he gave out refunds.
Well, and your allusion to 12-year-old boys, on the streets is, I mean, that's the same illusion he's making here. Only he's putting it interestingly towards Harvard. And the thing about that is you gotta think about this in context. No one went to Harvard. No one. It was a tiny school, right? So we're talking about very wealthy children, right? In the upper caste of society, right? Right. So, right, so you can, like, there's a lot of social commentary going on here that we're not going to get because everyone goes to college now, except me because I'm smarter, smart enough to avoid that trap. So, but, like, everybody goes now. So, like, and like pretty much anybody can get into Harvard if they try hard enough, right? I mean, that's the myth anyway. And Harvard's, like, the number of people that are let into Harvard now is off the charts compared to what it was back then. I don't know what it was back then, but as I recall, it wasn't a lot, So yeah, I don't know what the enrollment numbers were in the early to mid 1800s, but they weren't very high, and it wasn't exclusive. I mean, it's an Ivy League school for a couple of reasons. One of them is it's hard to get into, So the college in general we're talking top 10%, So Harvard's like a top 1% thing, and Harvard and Princeton and Yale, and right, but Harvard being the oldest, of course, and so he's
They've
making
got this reputation for being kind of riotous, kind of free flow, which is a sort of thing that wealth, because these guys are coming from wealth and privilege. You could get away with more of that, maybe your uncle, is the judge in the town, and like you're going to be able, you'll look the other way from something that somebody with less means and less education and less connections is going to get into bigger trouble for. So,
when you might think this is a spurious or unusual thing to do, but like, how did F. Scott Fitzgerald get popular? And I would argue his writing's not all that great, but that's a different book club. That's his critique. His critique is of the wildness of the wealthy youth. I mean, that's his whole shtick. He doesn't have another shtick, and so it's not like this is unheard of or something, right? I think if you look further in literature, you'll find it more often. The problem for us is, like, we really don't realize how much of an indicator of caste wealth was in the United States. Right. And I mean, there are other indicators like which church you went to, for example, right? I mean, there's a very big deal about, if you read Colin Woodard's excellent book, American Nations, there's a very big deal about the fact that the Northeast basically ran the government for the first, like, 2 generations of the country after it was formed. And that was this is all tied up in Civil War and everything too. Like, it's kind of a big deal. And we don't even have a sense for that anymore, right? Because politics is a secular thing apart from all these other things. And, I mean, once JFK breaks the Catholic glass ceiling or something of presidency, I can't even conceive of it. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. It already happened by the time I came around, right? So, yeah, it's very strange.
Yeah, and a lot of that was melted down in World War II, and it is worthwhile to treat World War II as an epochal event because it was so big and everybody was involved in it, and it brought together a lot of things, industry, commerce, government, the army, and like it in order to do all of that, we just needed to have so many people involved in this movement to fight this war. It brought the nation together in a way.
This is the lead up to the Great War. This is the critique of
right.
all of the things that caused the Great War. That's what this is. Like, he's prophetic, right? Even he's not the only one. A lot of people were warning about this, right? They all saw it coming because it was clear as day back then to people who were paying attention. And granted, most people couldn't pay attention because they were busy living their lives. But he's a wealthy merchant, right? He's the son of a wealthy merchant. He's got plenty of time on his hands. He can just go whaling, write books, do whatever he needs to do because he's educated. Right. But he in that class, much like Tucker Carlson, almost kind of, except Tucker Carlson's got a myriad of problems. He's no Melville, but he sees the problems, right? Just like F. Scott Fitzgerald does. He sees very clearly the problems within that space, and this is the critique of all of the bad things that led to all of the bad things that you're listing. And again, I mean, it without the thing that led up to the first conflict or first act of the Great War, we'll say the second act never happens, right? And there's tons of ways to avoid the second act. Like, you could have ended the Great War in Versailles, but for, right? And there's so many but fors. It's just like, you start digging into that history, you're just going to be like, it'll probably scar you. You'll probably lose all faith in the idea of governance of peoples. And you certainly won't touch globalism with a 10-foot pole once you see what happened there with Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations. I mean, that's a rabbit hole of rabbit holes, man. And it's so
This isn't peace. This is a 20-year armistice.
Exactly. Well, and the thing is, the number of people that knew what was going to happen and wrote about it contemporaneously to the events is absurd. And it wasn't unknown people, right? It was actual people who were in the know and had the quote power, right? And they couldn't do anything about it either, because there were just forces moving. And that's if you read this carefully, you're going to see, like, I mean, even in this particular chapter, right, there's forces moving things, and he's pointing to them, right? He's just saying, this happens like this. These two things are the same, but the whales are mysterious, by the way, right? Oh, well, that means that the radical Harvard kids are mysterious too, by the way. Oh, but you don't, he doesn't say that in the text, but your subconscious mind gets the message, believe me. Like, you really, that's part of what makes the book so good.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing with respect to the females all kind of gathering around in kind of a defensive position, and then the fact that, like, they wind up getting plucked off themselves. I just wanted to kind of show. So this is a defensive position of sperm whales.
1 second. Let me see if I can get this. Oh. I'm gonna get you.
Swap them with you.
There we go.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
So you can kind of see, like, they're all kind of pointed nose towards each other. So their perception is wildly degraded in that position. But also their sort of hands, as we've sort of just established in a previous chapter, are all pointed outwards. So, like, their ability to interact is pointed outwards, but then also their ability to actually perceive is compromised. So you have that aspect of, like, yeah, well, if you have 3 different boats around you, then it's like, yeah, you can whack one if it goes by your tail, but also, like, you're stuck in that position. So, and also, as we've seen, like, when they go and they hunt them, they're sometimes just poking them and then leaving them to bleed out for later, so you could easily hunt all, like, at least all those until they start running.
So I took a deer this weekend, right? And it was me and the guy who owns the land that I hunt with. He took his deer not 2 minutes before, right? He takes a shot at a buck. And of course, this is Brian. He's been doing this since he was 12. He's got a really dialed in 243, and it was like a 75-yard shot. So he got it right through the heart, no problem. And it died, 50 yards away from where he shot it. You shoot it, it jumps, it runs, it dies. Perfect shot. Okay. Not 2 minutes later, after the gunfire, there's a dead deer with blood everywhere. 15 feet away from where that deer died, another one runs by, and I shoot that one. Okay. So part of what makes human beings such effective hunters is we use these unnatural means that the animals are not accustomed to. The deer aren't really all that afraid of one gunshot. They're like, that's odd. I'm hungry. I'm going out anyway, I think the boats have the same sort of effect with sperm whales, but they're just not, like, accustomed to it. I don't know how many predators a sperm whale would even have, right? Like, I think killer whales can take out like a calf. Like, that's, and there's actually some pretty cool footage of, like, a helicopter shot of, like, a pack of sperm whale or a pack of killer whales um, basically just chasing a mother and calf. I can't remember what species of whale it was. Might have been a baleen whale, a little more, but they don't have a whole lot of natural predators. So, like, the fact of any predator is probably just they don't know, they don't have the instincts equipping them to handle these things, just like deer don't know what gunshots are.
Yeah, and with the
So,
killer whales, like I think I saw something where it's like a killer whale, like if struck to the head with a sperm whale's tail, will actually die in the single strike. Like it's just like yeah, but that's why you need like a whole bunch of them. But
mhm,
also with the defensive position that those whales I showed are in, if you had a pod of orcas coming around those, you actually probably could kill all of them if you were those sperm whales. But with some boats that are above the surface hurling harpoons at you, like it's completely unnatural because
yeah,
you don't have
yeah.
that type of trajectory underwater, you know.
And so, note well, human being, what technology can do to you, huh? Do you really have the capacity to see the raw Twitter feed?
What the whaling boats have been turned on you, dear viewer.
Yes.
That is the problem. I was actually just before, part of the reason why I'm late, was talking to somebody and explaining to them, no, algorithms don't work at all without data. That means all algorithmic corruptions are not bad programming, they're bad inputs. And what does that mean? Well, the bad inputs aren't coming from Google, my friend. The bad inputs are coming from actors because you got rid of the gatekeepers. So when you get rid of the gatekeepers, you just get more access to more bad actors. You don't solve the problem, right? And I used the example. I said the solution to the problem of, we have an FDA that doesn't care about food safety or something, which is roughly the thesis that RFK Jr. is running under. The solution is to put a good person in place, not to get rid of the FDA. Right? That's always the solution, is not get rid of the media. It's no, put good people in charge of the media. Because you get rid of the media, you're going to get, and we've already seen this, I mean, even Twitter's gotten corrupted with the community notes, where they're spurious community notes about, okay, that's maybe that is a correct fact, but it's not important to the point being made in the post, and you're just corrupting the algorithm and making it seem like something was downvoted when in fact it wasn't, right? So you end up with all these technological things going on. But I think that's why he's anthropomorphizing the whales. He's showing you the dangers of technology, right? I mean, he's actually making that point in this book, and we don't even appreciate it at some level. And also the he's critiquing a lot of different things, which is just stunning to me. I don't know. This is great. I don't know how you cram all that into a book, but he's done it.
It is a big bookmark.
I was thinking about this thing, so yesterday we talked just a little bit about this aspect of like, being able to hit something at a distance and like the context around that wildly changing. So I was kind of thinking about this with respect to, as you kind of mentioned, technology. Like there's a lot of this aspect, especially when it comes to distance. You think like cars, like in a sense, they speed up time, because we don't usually think about things in miles. It's like, how long does it take me to walk versus ride a bike versus ride a car or take an airplane to this place? And then so whatever that technology is, it's essentially speeding up time depending on the perspective you're taking.
We haven't figured out how to conquer space yet, but we can speed up time.
Yeah. And there's consequences as well. Like you wind up making trades between space to get, faster time. And that's sort of like you get these enormous roads that are just ridiculous. But I was thinking about that also with this aspect of the harpoons on ropes and stuff. So like that type of thing does actually exist underwater, but just not at that distance and that fast. So when it comes to like jellyfish, or for my invertebrate lovers out there, sea jellies, and sea anemones, that they have these things called nematocysts. So when like a person gets stung by these things, it's not that there's some sort of adhesive on the tentacles that are there, but there's actually lots of super tiny pores that actually shoot out little harpoons on little like membrane ropes. And that is, you have been harpooned hundreds of times when you touch one of those things. Some of them are just so light, like with the sea anemone, that it's, unless you're like a fish with super thin skin, like it's not going to affect you, and you can just rip that off. But also, like, you should touch your mouth afterwards because you actually have, 300 little harpoons in your head.
That's why they use tape to take that off instead of
Hmm.
tweezers.
Yeah. And then with the sea jellies, like some of those just come out at much greater force and have a much sharper tip and everything. But yeah, so that's essentially what's happening. So also, once you have, like, if you've been stung by a jellyfish or something, like, you have a bunch of harpoons in you. And just like when these guys go and they put the I forgot what they called it, like the wooden bits that slows it down, but like that's essentially what's also happened to you. It's like these are like poison tipped harpoons that you have just been struck with a ton of times, and then you go off and you die, or at least slow down and not become an issue, and somebody else will pick you up.
Yeah. All right. Boy, yeah, there was a lot in that little chapter, huh? A lot in that little chapter. That's why this is an interesting book. Let's go on to 89. And 89 is a little commentary on the laws of the high seas, and there are two laws of the high seas. One, a fast fish belongs to the party fast to it, and number two, a loose fish is fair game for anyone who can soonest catch it. And out on the seas, I don't know any other way to do things. Like, this is suitable enough, but it's basically just whatever whale you can hold on to is your whale. That's basically what this all comes down to. But then he makes the point that okay, these laws are very simple, but the custom for interpreting these laws can get quite a bit more complicated. And he talks about this loose this case that was, I think, actually settled in Holland, no, and it was in England. It was in England. A whale trover. The plaintiffs. So basically, the plaintiffs had harpooned a fish and were trying to take it in, but then they had to abandon their boat because of the tail or something, some kind of danger. And then another captain came along and not only took the fish, but also took the harpoons and the line and the boat. And the plaintiff said, that's too much. You can't possibly have all of that. We need at least our stuff back. The judge ruled that the defendants get to keep the whale, the harpoons, and the lines because they were able to grab onto that. But the plaintiffs got to have their boat back because it wasn't actually like physically attached to the whale, and their abandoning it was only to save their own lives. So it's kind of a Solomon split down the middle sort of thing. But those sorts of things can easily be split, so it doesn't get all that crazy. And then we get this last paragraph. We got to talk about this one, right? What are the rights of man and the liberties of the world but loose fish? What are all men's minds and opinions but loose fish? What is the principle of religious belief in them but a loose fish? What to the ostentatious smuggling verbalists are the thoughts of thinkers but loose fish? What is this great globe itself but a loose fish? And what are you, dear reader, but a loose fish and a fast fish too? It's just like, oh, snap. Yeah. So another one of these things where we're doing the social critique of like, well, we've got these laws and we've got this notion of justice, but basically whoever gets to grab onto something and hold on to it gets to keep it, because that's what was America in 1492 but a loose fish? Was Poland to the Tsar, or Greece to the Turk, India to England? What will Mexico be to the United States? All loose fish.
Yeah, and I think early on in the chapter, the beginning of, what is it, the 5th paragraph or something, these are scientific commentaries, but the commentaries of whalemen themselves sometimes consist in hard words and harder knocks. And it's like, so it's a critique of legalism, right? And it's a critique of science at the same time. It's saying, to the extent that science causes legalism, it doesn't work. Why? Because people are going to do what they're going to do, right? And they're going to warn you first, right? Pretty harshly, but then they're just going to do it. And there's not, there's not much for it really. and I think that's like, again, this is all because this is all leading up to the great conflict. And that was the argument. I mean, I don't think there's any serious historians that don't agree that the beginning of the Great War was contract law gone wrong. It's just treaties, and not just treaties. It was interpretations of treaties, because there were opportunities not to cause a global war over some of these treaties. There was room in the treaty, and they just opted to not go that way. And
because they were going to have it wrapped up by Christmas.
Hey, they had it all scientifically mapped out, just like Napoleon would have, which is where all this comes from, for real, which is just frightening. I mean, it's not like, that's not the genesis of this line of thought, but it's the genesis of this pattern being successful enough that people get the idea that, oh, but for Napoleon would be our emperor. It's like, no. And to be fair, like, Napoleon solved a big problem. The French Revolution is a whopping horrific problem, the likes of which would not be seen again until the Great War. It's like, yes. And all the critique of that is actually sitting right here, which I find utterly fascinating. I'm like, I don't know how many people read this and understand the history enough and the context enough. And I'm only barely there, and like, I don't know who gets the real message here, and the failure, right? Because in some ways the book's a complete failure, because the Great War still happens. And had you listened to Ishmaelville, unreliable though he may be, you wouldn't have fallen in for any of that stuff, because he outlined it all here.
Books aren't enough. They can be helpful, but they ain't enough.
I was looking at, there's just the way that he lays out, especially the first part of this chapter, is just so great. There's a few lines I highlighted that are just kind of in sequence, but he says, the most vexatious and violent disputes would often arise between the fishermen, where there not some written or unwritten, universal, undisputed law applicable to all cases. And then he says, they provided a system for which terse comprehensiveness surpasses Justinian's Pandex and the bylaws of the Chinese Society for the Suppression of Meddling with Other People's Business, which is that I would love if that was real. And then he says,
perhaps it is.
It might be.
It might not be a great translation of what the Chinese, but like, China's big, man.
Yeah,
it's got a long history,
possible.
so maybe they needed to have a society to.
It might be. And then he says, what plays the mischief with this masterly code is the admirable brevity of it, which necessitates a vast volume of commentaries to expound it. And it's funny because, like, yesterday we were talking about this aspect of, like, bringing about a higher good of something, but that higher good is not necessarily like, okay, great, everybody's happy now. It's like, no, now we're just trying to make an agreement to, like, the proper principles, and it's like, that might just be that you have a boat full of holes and you've patched all of them. That doesn't actually, that's not the ideal situation. And I kind of mentioned, you look at, like, the Mosaic Law, and you have all these things where it's like, oh, what are all these strange laws? And it's just like, what if we just had, like, I don't know, 10 of these or something like that? And of course everyone would follow those, but it's like, the fact that people weren't doing that, like, yes, you have all these things where it's like, oh, if you breach this, then there's, like, a lot of hoops you have to jump through, or, like, we kill you outside the camp. And it's like, all right, we need to, like, not depopulate ourselves here, so we gotta, like, set some other standards and things like that. This is not the perfect thing, but, like, this is the best we're gonna do right now. And but I love the whole, like, court case that he lays out, that it's like, as long as someone has something attached to the loose fish, he says, whether it's a 9-inch cable or a telegraph wire, or even, like, a piece of cobweb, like, it's all the same thing. Just someone has just anything connected to it. And then he kind of wraps it up where they made, like, the ultimate judgment was something like that. If a person, like, left his wife, even if she was bad or something, that he can't just, like, show up 20 years later and, like, try to, like, do takebacks or something. And it's like, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I mean,
there's
because there was a line here that it was uh, fish is technically fast when it bears a waif or any other recognized symbol of possession, so long as the party waifing it plainly evince their ability to take it at any time to take it alongside, as well as their intention to do so. So it's not like you can just, put a token in a fish and then just leave, and then they're like, well, somebody put the I can't remember what the term was, but like the buoy that slows the fish down. If there's no other fit like boat in sight, it's like, okay, we can just take this fish, right? And it's like, I think that can actually work. But if it's like, oh, there's a whaling vessel that's just waiting for this one to slow down enough to take it now.
yeah,
Pete's sake, are you really gonna go in there and pick a fight like that? Like
yeah.
it might not be worth it. So, and if
Well,
this happens to get back on shore,
that's the problem with legalism. There's all kinds of holes in it. Um, I'm sure they deal with that in your canon law school, Father.
yeah,
Right?
you just ask the bishop to give you a dispensation from any inconvenient law, and
Well,
usually you can do that. So
but that's what judges are for, right? Judges
right.
are to smooth over the ambiguity, and that's the purpose of a judge, right? If we could just apply the law, we would just do that, right? There's some cases where you can and should, and judges get in the way, which just makes everything harder. It's almost like we live in an imperfect world or something, and that would be worse if we were also imperfect people. But let's not talk about that. That's depressing. So, but this idea of time and the compression of time, and that's really what its example is about. It's like, no. They had the whale. That was their whale. They were still fast to it in some sense. They only had to let it go because there was a minor problem. But they were there, right? It's not like they weren't in sight. And then, like, this is one of those exceptions. Like, of course, it's their whale. What do you mean the other ship gets to take it? That's nonsense, right? And so he's just highlighting these problems that you run into, and how the difference between how they're resolved, we'll say, back at port and while you're at sea. And I think that's it, right? Because again, this is all, this can all be exapted out, or if you want to use fancy Vicky words, or it can all be seen as metaphorical, right? Or part of the self-similar fractal nature of reality. And if you just go one layer up, you can kind of see that pattern one layer up too, right? And that to me is what's so fascinating about it. It's like, yeah, we've got all this, all of this warning from Ishmaelville here about this, this legalism, and then lo and behold, it causes a big problem.
And there's also a little bit of like the scale below as well that's kind of shown here. So there's also the dispute not only of the whale and the harpoon attached to it, but also the boat that they abandoned, and the defendants wanted to keep all of it. Like even the other boat, they wanted to keep, and that was the only thing given to the plaintiffs. But that in the final determination, it said that the harpoon was the property of the fish. And it's like, oh, that's an interesting. So then you have like, okay, the whale is dead, but it is still an owner of property, and therefore by acquiring the whale, then you've also acquired the lower tier, or like the
And you
lower
can make
scale.
sense of that, right? Because like, let's
can.
say you take a whale that's had a harpoon in it for 2 years.
Yeah.
Well, that's your harpoon now, right? Because like,
Yeah.
obviously it is. So
Yeah. And
there's a great Roman saying, Roman legal saying, hard cases make for bad law. So you with these hard cases, you shouldn't try and deduce too many applicable principles. Sometimes something really weird happens, and you just got to kind of make do with what it is. But you shouldn't let that like make all your substantive cases weird, So
I think we saw the one whale whose skin actually grew over a harpoon. It's just like, yeah, it's like, at what point does it become completely ridiculous to legislate? And there probably is a point way before the skin completely grows over it that it's appropriate to just let that go.
But that's the compression of time right there. I mean, he highlights that, and then of course at the end he links it to nations or countries, right? And then he links it to people, individual people. And so he's showing this principle applies all the way up and all the way down and all the way up and all the way down, right? Because he's starting from international waters, right? And sort of coming in from there. But he's really also starting bottom up, because he's saying, look, man, what whalemen do while they're out on sea is different from the scientific version of the landlubbers, effectively. And yeah, it's very subtle, but it's super powerful. And like, if you're going to read this section, really, it's go to the movie theater, grab some movie theater popcorn, and then read this section, because this is the only way. It's the only way. It's fantastic. It's such entertainment.
Is that a commentary about how you're a fast fish once you walk into the movie theater and you're unable to pay any price, but the price that they're charging you for popcorn?
Yeah.
For 50 cents worth of popcorn, you'll pay 9. I mean, it's how they run that business. Never mind the economics of movie theaters. Okay. Now we get to chapter 90, where we get to see this principle in action. Starts off with a little bit of Latin. De bellina vero sufficit, si rex habeat caput et regina caudum. Concerning the whale, it truly suffices that the king should have the head and the queen the tail. Well, yeah, you don't need the footnotes when you got me around. You can just get a live translation.
I was a little disappointed in myself. I mean, I did fail Latin every year I took it, but usually recognize more words than that. And I was like, oh my goodness, what are all these Latin words? I only know like 3 of them. This is bad.
Yeah. So there's this old law that the king had the right to the head of a whale and the queen the tail. And this comes from some old comment. Let me see if I can pull it up. I had it in my real book here. Concerning the laws and customs of the Angles from Henry de Brockton. So it's from the 13th century, so a long predates Blackwood, which would be kind of the standard commentary there. And Melville makes a point that a division, if you're going to give the head to the king and the queen to the tail, it's a division in the whale is much like having an apple. There's no intermediate remainder. So he's got some opinions about the quality of this law, and he applies it to some whalemen who do the old English style, where they get the whale to the beach and are going to start covering up there. But the Duke comes and says that he gets all of it, and you just get this scene where, like, you've got these rather simple, hardworking men who've just dragged a whale to the beach, hard work, and they're just getting ready to finish the hard work, because it's enough work to take skin and debone a deer, and there's a lot more of a whale. And the Duke comes up and says, "Oh, it's actually mine." And there's really not much that they're able to do with it.
Well, it's his functionary. It's not the Duke.
Oh,
That's
yeah,
the other
yeah.
problem. It's not actually the Duke. They're
Yeah.
like, under what authority, sir? And he's like, well, actually, the Duke's, right? So.
And then there was some pretty interesting stuff here about the king gets the oil out of the head and the queen gets the tail, and there's the tailbone is used to make dresses somehow. I think we probably just use a bimetallic wire these days. And then there's something about the king receiving the dense and elastic head and linking that between the whale and the sturgeon as the 2 royal fish. So I had a hard time making heads and tails out of this one. Maybe you gentlemen can help me out.
So there's a... Go ahead.
This is easy. He's basically, this is a direct commentary on medieval feudal society. It's like straightforward as it gets, right? First it says, look, there's this old freaking law from back, from before anybody even knows such things existed, right? That says this, right? And then of course it's Ishmaelville, so he loves to inappropriately apply things, and somehow links that back to the property rights of a duke. Right. And so what he's doing is he's explicitly putting into question why the duke should own anything that comes up on the beach, despite all the work from these people. And it'll be interesting because Castle's often a bit more careful than I am with the text. It wasn't clear to me if they had actually, if the duke had actually paid the people or not, directly or indirectly. It looked to me like it was an open question. Like the duke said, yeah, of course I took care of it. How dare you question me or something? But I didn't get a sense that there was an indication that he had actually remunerated the people for their work. And maybe that's indirect. Maybe the duke says, hey, listen, they're my subjects. I remunerate them all the time by letting them live, or, because that was also an attitude that existed. And so, I mean, so we're right after the French Revolution, when like the French Revolution is the sort of the pinnacle event of the end of feudalism in Europe, like the last gasp of feudalism in Europe. And this is still right. We're right in that middle commentary, right before the great conflict, the Great War. And so there are still open questions. I mean, this is an open question, and it seems to be that the conclusion here is that no, the Duke should not have done that. But Castle, did you get a sense for whether or not the people got paid? I didn't. I couldn't make heads or tails of that.
So I don't think they did. I have a little reflection on this one. I just want to mention one little thing. So I thought it was there's this great little line. There's a few things I highlighted in this one. It's just a really fun, because he's doing the same thing that he has been doing, where he's been taking like 3 or 4 chapters and then like builds up to a certain thing. And like, actually, I won't say it right now, but the very last line of this actually like just exemplifies exactly what he was building up to in the last couple of chapters. But there's this sort of aspect also of like, okay, well, I'm acquiring this thing, but also it's actually somebody else's property, but it's mine too, as a result of that person being my property as well, or being proper to me. And so I like the sort of aspect of, okay, you're taking the head and the tail of the whale, which are like the two like main parts of the whale. Like it's essentially a head and a tail. And he says, a division which in the whale is much like having an apple. There's no intermediate remainder. It's like, yeah, you can have the side fins, like, for all your work. But this is just too excellent that we can't like not give it to the king and queen. And so there's
also, I want to just quickly interject. Sorry.
Yeah.
Remember earlier on in the book, we actually commented on how ridiculous it is that he casts the whale as not having a body.
Yeah.
Right. And to your point, like, I just wanted to really highlight that. Like, no, he really did set this up. He really did.
It's amazing how much like intentionality there is behind this stuff. And like even in like the titles and stuff, and so many of these like sequences that we get where it's like, yeah, he's really thought this stuff out. And then the other stuff just kind of flows probably. But he says, the Lord Warden is busily employed at times in fobbing his perquisites, which are chiefly by virtue of that same fobbing of them. And then he says, so these poor whalemen go and they're exhausted and probably covered in salt and all these things, and they're trying to work the whale on the beach. And it says, up steps a very learned and most Christian and charitable gentleman with a copy of Blackstone under his arm, and laying it upon the whale's head, he says, hands off this fish, my masters, as a fast fish. I seize it as the Lord Warden's. And there's this funny like back and forth of just like the non-negotiation happening, where they say, oh, but we did all this work, it's his. Or, oh, we went through all this and we risked our life. Oh, it's still the Duke's, It's like, what about my poor bedridden mother? We're trying to pay for it. It's like, no, it's still the Duke's. And then, we get to, let me see, that it was seized and sold, and His Grace the Duke of Wellington received the money. And then an honest clergyman of the town respectfully addressed His Grace. And it says, pleading the case of the unfortunate mariners. And he says, to which my Lord Duke in substance replied, and both letters were published, that he had already done so, that he had already taken their plight into consideration, not that he paid them, and that he received the money, and that he obliged the reverend gentleman if for the future he, the reverend gentleman, would decline meddling in other people's business. So it's just like, yeah, just and yeah, I'm not sure if he he didn't pay anybody. Like he shut down even the higher authority. Like the spiritual authority just also got completely shut down. So there's like this simultaneous shutting off of the above and below too.
Well, but it's interesting. I mean, people probably won't catch this. I certainly almost missed it myself. Right? Who is the Lord Warren the Duke? And then every subsequent question of negotiation is effectively referred back to the authority of the Duke, not to the Duke himself, right? He doesn't say no. He doesn't say, no, you will not be remunerated. No, you cannot. The Duke will only take a quarter. He doesn't speak on behalf of the Duke at all. Right. And so, like, this is actually correct. Like, this is exactly 100% correct. Like, all societies have worked this way since the dawn of time, and we should probably go back there. Different book club. And then it's after I have my book about why everything's wrong and how to fix it. We'll do the book club. But then, to your point, Castle, then it just turns out that when it's raised to the proper layer and addressed at the proper layer directly to the Duke from somebody who has the authority to talk to the Duke directly, the Duke fails to do the right thing, right? And he makes an appeal. I mean, you could argue that the appeal is valid, but that was that appeal is the French Revolution. That appeal is the English Revolution. That appeal is the American Revolution. That's the appeal. The appeal is not, you have to give us some consideration. And, Ishmaelville here has his finger on this so much. And I'm sure most of the people that read this have no idea how important, like this chapter in particular, but to your point, Castle, I mean, he's been really very carefully leading up to this particular critique. And I just found it absolutely brilliant and fascinating the whole time I was reading it. And it's sort of, it would be sort of interesting to divide the book up into these points and then go through them instead of in chapters, right? In some other manner, just because they're so important in terms of what they're saying about the world. And I think that's really what's missing from, we'll call it recent literature, is they're not making points about the world. It's always points about an individual life or an individual town, or they're very base level, banal, sort of boring points, and every once in a while you get a superhero thing where they're saving the world and there's nothing in between.
And it's just New York City.
The world. Right.
It's either New York City or Tokyo that they're saving.
Well, or the whole world, because Superman saves the Earth.
But you can't show somebody saving the whole world. What they do is they save New York City, and you imply the rest of the world.
Well, no, I mean, the Superman comics, he saves the whole world a few times, like the whole Earth, right? But it doesn't work because you can't relate to it, and it doesn't talk about the middle, right? Because most people think, like, the way we are thinking about the world, which is completely wrong, is that it's the billionaires, right? And I've actually said this in at least one of my videos. I said, listen, the people that rip you off are millionaires and tens of millionaires. They're not billionaires. The billionaires actually never rip you off, ever. That doesn't happen. The billionaires like Soros rip off entire countries sometimes, like England. That happens because that's the layer that they play at. Like, if you're a billionaire, you're not playing at the layer of the household. Like, you don't even know what households are at some point. You can't see them, right? But the people who have tens of $millions who live down the street, who are like lawyers, right, or whatever, they're the ones that are screwing you. For sure. Like, those are the guys who have access to you, and that's where they get that's why they only have tens of millions of dollars, because they're playing in a sandbox where they can only get $100,000 a pop or something, right? That's, or $400,000 a pop or whatever it is. Like, and that's how the world works. But we don't have any recent commentary on that level of corruption. And I think that's why we don't see it, because we don't have any literature about it. But here, Ishmaelville here is doing a wonderful job of exemplifying the layers and how they all interrelate and what the proper relationship should be, and showing proper relationships sometimes and improper relationships others, right? And just like being very matter of fact about it. I mean, I find it super refreshing that someone's done this work in the past. I just wish they'd be doing it like now.
Now, I caught a couple of other things. So I realized, so there's this aspect where he said that basically everything is a fast fish. And but of course, but also the reader is simultaneously both a fast fish and a loose fish. But there's this aspect too. I'm thinking now of that. Not only is the guy who's on the Duke's behalf declaring the thing a fast fish, and like we've had the sort of establishment of like, okay, the fish has property and everything, but also all of these other layers are being referred to as fish. So we're not just the way that he's not just referring to whales as fish and like anything in the ocean as fish, but he's also referring to actually everything else as a fish at this point. And so he's doing it on behalf of the Duke's authority, to your point. But then the Duke, in not paying anybody back, is actually appealing to the authority of the king and queen. And so the Duke himself is a fast fish, so he can't speak on his own behalf. So he's appealing to the higher authority. And then the king and queen are doing, because of course this has been in law. Like, what are the king and queen going to break the law? So it's like, it's all just completely locked in. And then there's this funny thing of like why they actually were giving the head and the tail to the king and queen, not just because it was excellent, but that they said, that the whalebone, which was like baleen, is supposed to go to the females, but some legislators surmised that was in the tail, even though it's actually in the mouth. And like, I guess it was being used as like support for stuff like corsets or like some sort of compression device. And then and it says, but she gets the tail instead, even though they did it specifically so she could have that for her wardrobe. And it says, but is the queen a mermaid to be presented with the tail? An allegorical meaning may lurk here. And then he says, I know not that any other author has hinted of the matter, but by inference, it seems to me that the sturgeon must be divided in the same way as the whale, the king receiving the highly dense and elastic head particular to that fish, which symbolically regarded may possibly be humorously grounded upon some presumed congeniality. And thus there seems a reason in all things, even in law. And it's like, it all just comes down to, again, like just comparing the king's head to the dense and squishy head of a fish. It's just like, it's so ridiculous, but such a great end to that series of chapters leading into another story chapter.
Well, and apparently, according to the excellent comments here, there's a further critique available to us as the result of, we'll say, historical interpretations. Oh, I like that. So the East India Company's wrapped up in this corruption too. Yeah, well, I wouldn't put it past Melville to recognize and acknowledge that the Duke of Wellington is the bad guy as the result. And again, like if this doesn't prove what I've been saying all along, this is a deep historical critique of the end of feudal Europe. And the beginning of the rebellion when there's a wholesale change in governance, right? And the idea of the country emerges, and all kinds of strange things happen, leading to a great war in 2 acts. And the entire American rebellion, as I like to call it, is the fault of the East India Company. Right? And if you need to know more about that, you can watch Navigating Patterns. Where we have excellent talks on history. So I think that's actually interesting. I didn't know any of that, obviously. So it's a very deep book in terms of commentary. You could probably dig forever on this, just like Plato's Republic, and not really get to the bottom.
Yeah, you went to the bathroom right after finishing this chapter, so I might have read it with undue haste. But appreciate you guys. Appreciate all of you guys helping clear these things up for me, because, well, this book isn't safe to read by yourself. Getting on to chapter 91, which has just got some good old fashioned contempt for the French. You love to see it, and we've got 2 different types of whales which are not ordinarily sought after for the oil. You've got a blasted whale. You get the sense that it died a long time ago, and that the bacterial and the bloating of the gases kind of blows it up. Um, Smells absolutely horrible. I can't even imagine the sort of smell you would get with that. And you get a desiccated whale, one that appears to have died from some sort of disease, and those ones are a little more interesting. So we get the Rosebud, a French whaling vessel. It's just like, in case you haven't noticed at this point that this book is funny, read chapter 91, because the Rosebud has taken both a blasted and a desiccated whale. The captain is green, just fresh in from the cologne industry. And Stubb comes up alongside of it, and the there's a certain name for the fellow who's doing this work on it. Seems to actually know what's going on, and is very unhappy about working on a rotting whale. So Stubb, I think the English fellow from the um, uh, French ship really didn't like his captain. So Stubb says whatever he wants, and this fellow from the other ship translates it into French to convince him to let both of these fish go. And Stubb, once the French vessel sails off, because he convinces them that he's going to get an outbreak of disease on his ship for keeping both of them, he goes into the desiccated whale and gets the ambergris, which, if I recall correctly, Chanel number 5 is still made from ambergris, right? So it's still like this whale vomit is still a valuable commodity to the perfume industry. And if this guy recently from the cologne industry hadn't been utterly stupid, he would have known this. But Stubb and what was his name? You guys reading this? He just gets referred to by his title, the Guernsey Man or something like that.
Guernseyman, yeah.
The Guernsey Man. Basically, just he swindles his own captain. He must be really upset about taking this blasted whale,
Right.
probably against the advice of the Guernsey men there, which is another. Hey, if somebody who actually knows what they're talking about tells you that this rotted whale, which smells horrible, is not worth keeping around,
Well,
maybe you should listen to him.
He told him. He said, "I tried to convince my captain, and I couldn't do it. Maybe you can." And and Stubbs is like, "Oh yeah, maybe I can." It's like because he figures out they don't know about the ambergris, and I don't know what's going on because, well, the boat smells, right. The boat smells like cologne, right? But it's like I guess this is probably legitimately a critique of the competence of the French captain, because to your point, like, I mean, this whale stuff is used in perfume, and yeah, it's usually the bad part of the animal. I know with beavers, it's like the ass glands and stuff, and that's what the perfume is, right? And so it's always the horrible part of the animal where the best smelling perfume is made somehow. It doesn't smell nice in the beginning, by the way. It gets refined, but
Yep. Melville points that out.
Right, but yeah. I'm assuming this is some critique of competence at the industrial layer, right? Because you have somebody from another discipline coming into the whaling discipline, which, as we have established, is the noblest of all disciplines.
You can't just like show up and become a whaleman. That takes decades of experience.
That's right.
All cannibals need paperwork.
Exactly. Right. And so I think that's what this is. This is exemplifying that, because like all the little details, like the boat smelling too pretty, and Stubbs doesn't like it, right? Which is another little tell, right? And he says something too about the romanticism of the French, which I just found really amusing. But yeah, I can confirm the French are insufferable, and they would probably have a boat that you would want to be on because it would stink. And yeah, and they would think it was wonderful, and they would be incompetent. That's only the ones from Paris probably, but whatever, it's close enough.
Unfortunately, that's a large percentage of them.
Unfortunately for the rest of them, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, if not for the Crusades, damn, we might have taken Paris too. Fairly sure my film is from the south, but yeah, the southern France and northern France are not the same country and should not have been made as such. Can confirm. Same with Italy, by the way. Italy is like 3 or 4 countries, so yeah, not cool.
Yeah, and
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, it's that critique of the coming in and really, thinking because you've got the competence in one domain that it's going to transfer 1-to-1 to the competence to the other domain, because competence can like transfer, but it's not 1-to-1 at all, right? Like you've got to adapt to the new industry that you're coming into. You can't just, oh, I was good at this industry, now I'm automatically good at this industry. If you can learn and you can adapt and you can take what skills were useful in the old industry to the new one, that's super helpful. But to just walk in and think that you're going to be able to, it's like a second lieutenant coming in and, overriding the orders of his senior NCOs who damn well know better. You just don't do that. That's dumb. So, yeah.
Well, and also they deliberately perpetrate, conspire to perpetrate a ruse on the captain, where Stubbs is like, I'm just going to say random insulting stuff, and you can translate it however you see fit to get the job done. So the hilarity ensues with what he says. And then the translation is much tamer, and that whole thing.
But the translation has nothing to do with what he's saying.
Right, but I mean, it's so hilarious at that point. Like, it's so hilarious because Stubbs is just being like the most insufferable, arrogant, piggish, cruel person that you could imagine, and it's a wonder the translator doesn't burst out laughing because he understands and they had pre-agreed on this, right? Because and that's sort of about the separation between the head, the captain, and the workers, who had already told him, like, don't go after this thing, it's not worth it, like, what are you doing? And he got ignored. They all got ignored, and this is definitely another of these critiques.
Yeah. Like that's what's going to happen if you don't pay attention to your. I'll let you talk, Castle, but that's what's going to happen if you don't listen to your senior NCOs, right? If you don't listen to the senior master sergeant who's been doing this for 15 years, they're just going to turn against you because you're going to ruin this whole thing anyway. I may as well get some fun out of it on our way down. So.
I was really just kind of laughing at this aspect of like just the poor preparation. So we've kind of established that the Pequod is loaded up with the greatest water known to mankind for at least 3 years worth. So they don't have to touch that nasty stuff at the ports, and then he says that these French whalemen go out and they have their hold is full of boxes of tallow candles and cases of snuffers, for saying that all the oil they'll get won't be enough to dip the captain's wick into. It's just like, oh my goodness, he's just shredding them apart. And but let me see if I have this here. But yeah, so then Stubb goes and he's dealing with the Guernseyman, and he's already playing with them like right off the bat, and say like, oh, like the guy's holding his nose and he's like, oh, what's the matter with your nose there? Did you break it? And the other guy's like, you don't smell this? What's wrong with your nose? And he's like, oh, it's nothing. It's a wax one. I have to hold it on. He's just like, there's something really charming about Stubb, at least from like this guy's.
He may be the biggest jerk on the crew, but he's hilarious.
He really is. And his guys follow him very well. Like they successfully hunt whales all the time. And it's like, so there is something to that. And then, just more kind of making digs on the French people here, saying that they worked slow, but they talked very fast, and they're all in anything but good humor, vigorously puffing tobacco smoke. and everything. So it's just you've got all these different horrific smells with the. You got the perfume, and then you got the rotting whale corpses, and you got tobacco smoke. It's just like this complete, nightmare going on. And then yeah, just that he's just mocking that other captain right to his face, just over and over again. And then says, he gets even offered like a gesture of kindness to like come down and drink. And he says, thank him heartily, but tell him it's against my principles to drink with the man I've just diddled. It's just absolutely hilarious. And then just the absolute rat move of just never mentioning anything and letting everybody go off beyond the horizon while also just kind of letting the bodies like kind of float there and without actually showing that he did attach a line to it. And then they just kind of quietly, move the boat around so that they can start working it and getting the stuff. It's just, it was just a really entertaining chapter.
Yeah, that's what it is. There's a line in there about, and this was the romantic name of this aromatic ship, right? So I think he's critiquing romanticism as flattened by the French or something. So yeah, that's what I picked up on. There might be another reference in there, but that one in particular, I was like, oh yeah, this is the idea that romanticism is just, basically an incompetent dandy with some really inappropriate name going out on the ocean and trying to get rid of the vagaries of the stinky whales with their perfume and their silly candles, right? And yeah, so it's a critique of romanticism as such via the French, which I can't think of a better way to do it. More power to them.
That you're showing up with perfume and candles and then trying to mask the overpowering smell of the rotting corpses next to you by blowing smoke. It's just like, yeah, there you go.
Well, and that is the critique of romanticism.
Yeah.
Like that is the failure of romanticism as such. So you can just see these layers of social critique in the book. It's great.
And just in case you forgot about the plot, they would have recovered more ambergris, which what was it? He said worth a gold guinea an ounce to any druggist, right? So extremely valuable stuff. I think it's still probably about that price because Chanel number 5. You need it in case you smell bad. But Ahab's loud command for Stubb to desist and come on board, else the ship would bid them goodbye, is because they need to go get the whale, the white whale, which was the first thing they asked about again. We can move on to chapter 92. And, we many chapters ago, we talked about how Nantucket went out into death and brought life back. And this is just kind of a reprisal of that theme because this ambergris would, it comes from the inglorious bowels of a sick whale. It only comes from sick whales. It doesn't come from healthy whales. And there's something about nearby, there'd be little bits of squid bones embalmed in the matter. Right. So it's one of these things that's an extremely fine substance that comes from really horrible origins. And that's sometimes how life works is you got to go out into the horrible death to bring life back. Ask me how I know, what gutting and deboning a deer is like. But hey, we get sausage out of it. So that's not bad at all.
Yeah, so there's a lot of fun stuff here. I mean, so there's the thing, and I like the way that he tied it to St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians too, where he goes and he says, who would think that such fine ladies and gentlemen should regale themselves in an essence found in the inglorious bowels of a sick whale, and says like even to try to cure the dyspepsia that this is a sepsium of, you would have to like give it a whole bunch of like dyspepsia pills and then run away like you were setting off dynamite.
Laxatives.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's just absolutely.
In case you haven't noticed that this book is funny yet.
Right. And but there's that thing about like sowing in corruption or sowing in dishonor and then being raised in glory. And he says, don't forget the strange fact that of all things that they'll savor, cologne water in its rudimental manufacturing stages is the worst. And it reminds me a lot of like leather tanning, like really fine leather, like the amount of processing that needs to go to, like in old days before you had like a lot of hygienic advantages, like the tanner was actually like the grossest person in your town. Like that was just, they just smelled horrific. Their house smelled gross. Everything around them just smelled gross. Oh, like you didn't want to like shake their hand because then your hand is going to smell gross. Like you can't wash that off. And yet, like if you want fine leather, like even like something that like a king or queen would wear, like that, it has to undergo that process, and someone has to get their hands dirty too.
Refinement. Yeah. And that's the thing, right? And so he's, again, he's exemplifying the top and the bottom, right? Because he talked about earlier the king and the queen and the relationship to the middle, and now he's talking about the bottom and the relationship to the top again. And this the contrasting in this book is freaking amazing. It's just gorgeous if you can read into it, which I suspect a lot of people who read this book couldn't, but well, I don't know.
Well, you don't read it by yourself.
Right. Well, and also you need really good teachers who really know a lot of different stuff. And in that context of the fall of feudalism and the transition, because this is that transitory period away from the feudal era and into, we'll call it the recent error. Because by now, like, let's be a little honest, this isn't working out, guys. Sorry, I hate to say it. The experiment failed. If the Great War didn't convince you, let's look around. So this level of historical context is just not a lot of people have it, unfortunately. So that's, but it's great that it's here. I'm glad I didn't read it in school. I'm glad I'm reading it now with you guys. That's for sure.
I'd like to see that we also see like the same move that he keeps making, and it's funny how he's able to do it in different ways all the time. But that he goes after all this thing talking about stinking dead whales and all this stuff. And then he goes and he says, that if decently treated, whales are by no means creatures of ill odor. And he's just like, so he goes into this whole, and then of course he attaches that to, the distinguished but now indistinguishable, whaleman. By extension, of course, also can't be picked out, So you have that whole aspect going on there where it's like, actually, I've been telling you about how bad this stuff stinks, but actually, it's actually so good. And all the people who are working in it are just, like you would never be able to tell them, like a tanner or something like that. You couldn't tell them apart. And that if you were to make a comparison to the sperm whale, he's actually so fragrant, not only not gross, but he's actually so fragrant and amazing smelling that he's like the elephant with jeweled tusks, redolent with myrrh, that was let out of an Indian town to honor Alexander the Great. It's just like, really, you just immediately do an about face at the end of like a series of chapters about how gross whales can be.
Yeah, well, I mean, they live in the water and they get lots of exercise and are constantly outdoors. So
yeah,
Melville makes those points.
Yeah.
Taking a bath all day. How could you possibly smell bad?
Yeah.
But hey, I've never encountered a whale, so I just got to take his word for it,
Fair enough. But we can hypothesize.
We can hypothesize about all sorts of things. And, with your hypotheses at about $1.50, I can go to a gas station and get a cup of coffee.
That's exactly right.
I think you're using the wrong term there. We can Ishmael-othesize, because that's definitely what's happening here.
Yeah.
All right. We get to chapter 93, and we get to learn a little bit about whales. So there's the people who go down into the whaling ships, but you obviously can't have every hand out in a whaling ship because somebody needs to still be steering the boat. So there are the ship's keepers who stay on the boat when the smaller boats are lowering for whales. And one of these guys is Pip, probably a descendant of slaves. but apparently from Connecticut, so probably a freed slave at that point. And Pip just seems like one of those guys that has everything go wrong for him. It sounds like he's a teenager and very nervous temperament, but by no means dull. Unlike Doughboy, he's just kind of dumb. But Pip is maybe a little too smart for his own good. And one of the people who would ordinarily go down into the ship got injured, and so it was left to Pip to do one of the oars. And on his first time out, when they didn't actually get a whale, he seemed okay. He was in Stubbs' boat, but the second time when they got a whale, the whale made a big bump underneath him. He jumped clear out of the boat and got tangled up in the line, and quite reluctantly, but to his credit, and I won't ignore it, Stubb ordered the line to be cut and the whale to be lost in order to save Pip. For the first offense, he basically says, "Don't expect me to come back for you again. Like, you get one warning on this, and next time you jump out of the boat, nobody's coming back for you." So of course Pip jumps again a second time, and he gets left behind, and he's out on the open ocean for a while, and it's only by sheer luck or providence, depending on how you like to look at these things, that he was picked up by the Pequod at all. But after that, Pip just wasn't quite. There was something about the experience of the open ocean and him being utterly alone out there in the infinite abyss that just kind of messed him up. So we'll hear more about Pip, actually. He very briefly came up in that bizarre chapter that suddenly switched genres on us many, many months ago. But he comes back again, and he'll be back. He'll be back.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting stuff going on here where, he kind of describes Pip as that he's like the jewel of the crew in a lot of ways. Like, he's extremely innocent, and he's actually shockingly upbeat all the time and everything. Like, he's joyful all the time. And he even kind of makes a reference. He's saying, that like in the clear air of the day, if you had like a diamond that was suspended on like just an older person's like blue vein neck, that even still, like, the person would actually look healthy by being associated with the jewel that's there. And he uses like a few other examples there, but then kind of talks about this aspect of, okay, well, even still, like, that's not enough necessarily for them to kind of just keep him around. And so, like, Stubbs saves him the one time, but then, and Ishmael is now kind of going around and, like, in a sense, kind of redeeming Stubb a little bit, like maybe unsuccessfully, but, he's kind of going, and he says, perhaps Stubb indirectly hinted that though man loved his fellow, yet man is a money-making animal, which propensity too often interferes with his benevolence. And it's like, well, he's only going to save you so many times. And, like, honestly, the fact that Stubb of all people saved anyone, instead of money, like, that's just, was clearly willing to screw over an entire crew, so it's like, but and he could have just as easily not picked up Pip the first time and expected, like, with the second time, that someone else could have taken him up onto the boat. Like, he wasn't necessarily, well, I think he was tied up the first time, and they had to cut him loose. And then so there's this kind of thing where he says, that Pip kept his body, but, like, unfortunately drowned the infinite of his soul, or at least most of it. And so there is kind of a darkening, I guess, of Pip's sort of joyfulness. So I think we're also seeing a little bit of, like, that a lot of the kind of, the joyfulness is maybe not going to last us too much longer here. It's 73% of the way of the book.
The plot's going to come back again at some point.
Yeah. The comic relief has now nearly drowned twice. So.
Well, and the interesting thing here is that he does make the allusion to the corruption of money, of man's soul, right, or the corruption of the commercial enterprise as such. He doesn't, unlike, we'll say, recent times, very recent times, past like 20 years, he doesn't immediately condemn commerce, right? He says there are limits to human generosity. It's like, well, there are too, right? Like, so it's not wrong, and it's not like they left him out there on purpose or anything, right? It's very much like, well, the first time you were in immediate danger, and we got you out because no whale's worth that, right? No whale's worth a man's life. But the second time you weren't in immediate danger, and to be honest, we all lost track of you. It wasn't like when we knew where you were and that you were in danger, we saved you. But the second time we just lost track of you. And so one way to look at this is man staring into the abyss, because he's very much just like lost in the abyss of the ocean. And I think that almost certainly where they are, because pretty much any ocean you're in, unless you're like really near the land in a harbor, this myth about being able to swim, you don't make much progress in
The
the
currents are going to
waves.
have a much bigger effect. The currents and the waves are going to have a much bigger effect than what you're able to.
You can't see.
Yeah.
You absolutely cannot see. I mean, unless it can be, the ocean can go flat, right? And there's a section of the Pacific in particular that's completely flat, but like most of the time. But like no. 99% of the ocean, 99.9% of the time is 5-foot swells. And you can't stand up. And so even if you're higher than 5 feet, you basically can't see. And the swells are moving, and swells move in dimensions you don't understand until you've been in them. And then you actually, if you have any sense about you, you get very, very frightened, because you realize the paucity of relativism really fast. You're like, oh, this is why relativism is bad. It's like, holy mackerel. Right. And then even just if you're at sea, in like 5-foot swells, which I have been a few times, unfortunately, it's like, I mean, it can be quite fun, but also, right. When you're low enough on the water, and the horizon isn't high enough above you, which is actually the normal case even around the coastline, what happens is you very temporarily lose sight of land. But because things are going like this in all possible dimensions, you turn fast enough that when you look where you were before, like if you don't move, and even if you try to account for what you feel the motion of the boat, you won't be pointed where you think you are. And that is way disconcerting. Now, if you're under sail, this is much less of a problem. But if you're stopped, it's terrifying. It can be very terrifying because it's completely disorienting. And that's why, like, when you have an experience like that, when somebody says, oh, you're being relativistic, you should be in terror immediately, because you've experienced actual real world relativism. You would realize that this is dangerous for your thinking too. And it's so dangerous, you shouldn't get anywhere near it ever. Like, it is that terrifying. So I wanted to make that clear, because people don't have that experience.
It's a matter of not just being lost, but being so lost that you don't have the capacity to find anything. Because we've been lost before, but
it's worse, because you catch glimpses and you go, oh, but that doesn't last very long. And even in cases where it does, like, you can imagine if you're walking towards your car, for example, and we'll say across the parking lot, you can imagine that you take 4 steps and then you're 3 feet to the left or the right of where you were, or perhaps 3 feet ahead or behind where you thought you were. And so just imagine trying to walk to your car like that. Even though you will get to the car and it's just going to take a lot longer than you thought, that process is devastatingly terrifying to your brain. I only say that because I've been there, and it is not a place you want to go.
We're designed, like our consciousness is designed for solid land, or it is not equipped for the ocean.
Well, we're designed for and used to linear and discrete ways of attack, right? And then the quote smartest among us, understand that arcs effectively, right? And so they can throw a spear in front of where the antelope's going to be and catch the antelope. And we go, oh, he's a genius, right? Those are the people with the upgraded skills. Like, we don't realize that just what I said is like huge. Most people can't do that, by the way.
That's why
Most
quarterbacks are the best paid people on the team.
right. Or Bobby Orr, famously, they ask him, like, how do you do it? And he goes, well, I just skate to where the puck's going to be. And everyone's like, that doesn't make any sense. And people like me know exactly what that means. And we're like, of course, that's what you do. Like, how can you not see this? But they can't, right? Which is even more terrifying. Like, what do you mean you can't see where the puck's going to be? I can see where a puck's going to be. I know where a ball's going to go. Like, just like something I was born with, I guess, or developed over time. But even with that skill, right, which I have, like when you're in the water and you move like that, and then you see where you are and you can orient for a fraction of a second, and then you're disoriented again while you're blind, that is like next level, and I've done it. Like, it's not the end of the world if you keep your head. I mean, but it can be like, it can be no matter how much you keep your head, right? But it is absolutely terrifying. And it is really hard for people to understand. And this is why people get seasick, right? Because they lose the horizon for a brief. If you just lose the horizon for like half a second while you're on a boat that's moving, that's what makes you seasick, right? That can make you seasick. That's why they tell you when you're on a boat and you feel nauseous, you got to look at the horizon, right? Because that restabilizes your sense of where you are.
And I think, and you've got this aspect of that. Now we're also looking at multiple things they're supposed to be tracking. So it's like, okay, how are we going to track the puck of Pip? Here when we're actually tracking a much larger moving target, and then and plus you've got the tossing waves and everything. It's like, yeah, it's absolutely impossible. And then it ruins essentially Pip's entire worldview. Like, not only was he lost and there's a traumatic experience there, like now people were like, oh, he's absurdly happy. Like, they actually think he's like kind of insane now. And like, he doesn't have the sort of same luster that he used to. And there's this line here that says, so man's insanity is heaven's sense, and wandering from all mortal reason, man comes at last to that celestial thought, which to reason is absurd and frantic, and weal or woe feels then uncompromised, indifferent as his God. So there's like, he's just completely, it's like exile upon exile upon exile. And now it's like, whatever happens to him, it's just like, he's not responding to the stimuli anywhere near the way that he used to.
When that's the domicide. Yeah. So this is really the story of domicide in this chapter. Yeah. If you want to understand John Vervaeke's domicide, it's right here, yeah. Right? And that level of disorientation is very well exemplified by this sort of experience. And again, like, on the one hand, you should try everything. On the other hand, I don't recommend that you do this to yourself on purpose.
You should absolutely not try everything. Don't listen to Mark when he says that.
Yeah, most people can't handle such things. But it is a larger, quote, philosophical, I hate that word, point, right? Which is nihilism bad, domicide not good, but also the inevitability of it, right? Because you're a small person in a very large world, right? And so there are casualties, right? And some of them may seem casualties of commerce, because remember, the contrast in this particular chapter is between, we know your life's in danger and we're absolutely going to save it and not do the commerce. That's actually what the book says, right? And it isn't between, oh, the second time it happens, you're out of luck, as Ishmaelville implies. That's actually nothing to do with what happens. The second time it happens, it's, look, you're one guy and we just lost track of you because it's a big ocean and we're on a mission and we just can't track everything. Right? And so the implication is actually that had they known, they would have saved him and not gone after the whale. But they actually just didn't know what was going on because they couldn't. And that's the key. And so sometimes
we couldn't even track all of that.
Right. Exactly. No one could track it. All these guys who can track everything, they track 70,000 whales and 4 boats at a minimum. And yeah, but you can't track and all the people on the boat, right? And all the other boats, because the implication is, well, he thought one of the other two boats would surely pick him up.
They were right behind him last time he looked.
They were right behind him. Surely they're going to pick him up. So, again, Castle's pointed this out many, many times, right? And hopefully it's really clear here. Like, he's undermining his own earlier point on purpose to make a larger meta point, and I really hate that word, right? To make a larger point about the randomness of life, right? The things that happen as the result of being involved in an enterprise that are not the fault of, we'll say, the stone commercial hearts of men who'd rather the money than save the life or something silly. It's not that at all. And it's brilliant that he does it this way. Unfortunately, I think most people will totally miss that in the book, but for somebody pointing it out to them.
So I'm thinking of also, you have this aspect of like Pip's perspective of this. So he was explicitly told that this was going to happen. Now maybe Stubb wouldn't have actually let it happen if he actually was aware, but it happened exactly according to Stubb's word. So he had this kind of aspect of, one, he felt super dejected the first time, and like he was actually treated as a failure when he came back. And so now he's like a double failure, and exactly what he was warned of did happen. And then you have this aspect of, these people left me for dead, because it wasn't even one of the boats, it was the ship picked him up. So these people said they were going to leave me for dead. They actually did it. I now have to live with these people again. And so it's like I got domiciled, but I'm still living here. So like that's massively disorienting too. And like I've had that before, like, as a kid, like actually being evicted from a place and then you still live there for 5 years because like there was some reconciliation there, but like evicted by family. And so there's like, that's an interest, like I've experienced that. But then you have this thing too, where, okay, let's say Stubb actually really didn't mean it. And maybe Pip believes that. And like, he actually thinks, okay, yeah, he was just warning me before this was an accident. And he comes to that. These people who were responsible for taking care of this kid clearly couldn't. And so like, that's also shattering. He is completely dependent on these people. So it's like, it's layers upon layers. No matter which way he looks, he's fractured.
And he only got into this position because of the misfortune of the other guy injuring his hand. Because everybody just looked at this kid and said, you could stay on the ship. Yeah. You'll get paid less, you'll get a smaller lay, but it's like, why don't you just stay on the ship, man? Like this is a little too much for you. And they were being correct. And it wasn't like an insult. It's just like, this guy's not dumb. He just gets really nervous. And, it makes me think of, some of the work that Dr. Peterson's talked about with post-traumatic stress disorder in soldiers and how there are certain qualities that leave you a lot more susceptible to it than you would be otherwise. And, maybe it's better off if we don't make those guys soldiers there. And, but there is actually still, on the ship, like we'll find something for you to do if you can manage it. Doughboy, he can just do whatever he does. Pip, he can do whatever he does. We'll make room for you, but like, don't get too put out if you're not considered up to snuff for going out into the infinite and fighting, a whale. Like be at peace. We'll put you to work somehow. And then also it's just, I don't know, the impression I got from reading this, it wasn't just the brush with death, but it was also the sheer vastness of the ocean that caused the domicide there. And like, I guess I've never had that problem because I was raised Catholic. It's like, well, it's a big universe, but God's in charge of it all, so I don't have to worry about it. And that was a lesson I must have absorbed at some point because I don't feel that at all. But I guess I can try and imagine it happening.
Domicide, see, this is the thing. And actually, Vervaeke does a good job of talking about this at some layer. I kind of disagree with some of his historical perspective, but the way he describes it is interesting, right? The people in Domicide didn't leave their homes. They weren't kicked out of their homes. Nothing local to them changed at all. What changed was they couldn't tell where they were in the New World Order. Right? So it's not like domicide is not like I physically lost my home, although it can be that. I have a whole video about that on my channel, by the way, Navigating Patterns. It can be that, right? But it can also just be like, no, my home's the same, but the world has changed, right? Or the government has changed, right? Or the rules under which I thought the government operated, which maybe I was always wrong about, by the way, have changed, right? Because I've become aware of them. Right. And so when you know where you are in the hierarchy and you have a hierarchy, the fact that the lower hierarchy sort of falls out from underneath you doesn't really matter because you still got anchor points, we'll say, much higher up. And that is the solution to domicide, would be my argument. But that's definitely not a book club topic. Although, again, this is a meaning crisis text fundamentally, and it's just funny that it's like, oh wow, it's all right here. Maybe you should send a copy to Vervaeke and say, please reread, like read more carefully, and oh, here are the historical references you need.
Yes, yes. If only we had that kind of access to people with big YouTube channels.
Oh, actually, we kind of do, but that's a different discussion.
Well, we'll leave that discussion for another time because we've got this last very odd chapter. A Squeeze of the Hand, chapter 94. And apparently, one of the jobs of the whalemen is that they've got all this whale oil and it needs to be smoothed out. And he's just got to put his hands into the tub and just squeeze all the lumpy bits. And he thinks this is the best thing in the world. Like it puts him, in a spiritual place where he can appreciate the harmonic convergence and the universal brotherhood of man. And it just smooths out all of the everything, and we pass into the blissful state of non-being together. And I don't really think that's much of an exaggeration. So
no, I mean, again, it's it's commentary about sort of the advantages and joy of doing nothing or pointless work, which I don't know how the world works at all. I was listening to Tammy Peterson talk to Bishop Barron. It's in 2 parts on Word on Fire, I guess. So this is in part 1, and he's talking about exactly that. There's a bunch of engagement that you have where there's no end result, right? But the engagement itself is valuable, and that's Melville's message here too.
like singing
right?
a song together. I guess
No,
I had the
praying by
experience when I
yourself,
was-
praying the rosary by yourself, because you begin and end at the same place.
yeah.
Right. It was worse. I was like, and you do it like he's like, all right, go off and do this an hour, or I think he said an hour in the morning every morning because I have a busy day, and if I don't do it, then I won't get to it. But he said, like, this is very comforting to me. I've heard him say that before too. I was just like, wow, it's weird that it came up again, and then we did this. So.
Yeah, this was probably the funniest chapter for me by far. Like since we started, I want to say, because he says that he had his hands in there, and that to his perception they started becoming like eels, like just serpentining and spiralizing. It's always there, like just. And he's not the only one doing it, which is like this is the most Ishmaelian behavior we've seen yet.
I can 100% imagine, Starbucks saying, "Yeah, you go over to the tubs. Don't handle the whaling spade."
Yeah. And he's there, and there's other people doing this, and they're grabbing like the congealed parts of the oil, and then he goes and he's grabbing other people's hands by accident and just squeezing them, and then he actually winds up doing it on purpose, and then these people trying to do their job, and and they're not having the same experience either, which is hilarious. Like this is not a natural sort of thing that everyone else is in on. But he's grabbing their hands, squeezing strangely with his eel fingers, and then looking into their eyes sentimentally. And so it's like he's doing this for who knows how long. Like strangely, they didn't kick him out. So like people are allowing him to do this, and he's just going around grabbing people's hands and looking at them. And then he goes.
I think it's just all a big joke,
Yeah. This was completely insane. and he and then he goes, and it's interesting because he actually arrives at like kind of a King Solomon sort of point of like, oh, all is vanity, and like, the important things is like the time that you spend with your friends and stuff. But then it becomes even more absurd where it's just like, let's just squeeze each other, and squeeze each other's hands and squeeze the entire universe together and all of these things, all of the it's just, and then he goes and he starts talking about these other different things. So like, what was the funniest thing about this? So he goes and he says, there's another part of I think it was of the blubber. Yeah, they call it plum pudding, and he said like, it just looking at it like you just want to eat it, and like you hear people say that like, oh, I wish I could just eat that thing. You get like the Tide Pod thing or whatever. Like they do look delicious, but also never do that, and it's like you take these things, and he actually goes and is actually plucking pieces of this inedible stuff and eating it when no one is looking. And
I think he just tried it. I don't think he
Right.
went eating it. There's a difference between trying something and eating it.
Fair enough. But even still, this entire chapter, for me, actually made me reconsider the things I said about how did he possibly get access to like these monologues that people are having by themselves. But now I'm thinking like he's so involved in just grabbing stuff and putting it in his mouth and grabbing other people's hands and all these other things. I actually no longer doubt that he's just standing on the other side, like beneath Ahab's window, just listening to a monologue. Like I think that's just the thing that he does, and like people are at sea, so it's either just kill him or let him do his thing.
There's probably one Ishmael on every crew.
Yeah. There's always a black sheep, right, or an outlier or two. The interesting thing for me is just one paragraph here. It says nippers. Right, that's the beginning of it. Just nippers. Period. And I'm like, what kind of grammatical nonsense is this guy up to here, right? And then it says strictly, this word is not indigenous to the Wales vocabulary. And I'm like, what even happened to the book? Where are we? I don't even know what happened. And it's so funny. I'm like, yeah, nippers is not indigenous to the Wales vocabulary. It's not indigenous to my vocabulary. Like, what is happening? It is, to Castle's point, I think it is the funniest chapter because it's just so all over the place. And yeah, I'm not actually. Ultimately, I'm not sure what things he's critiquing here, if anything, or if he's just taking a break from social critique to add a little popcorn flavor to the whole thing, because some of the stuff he says is so strange in this chapter. It's delightful.
Oh my goodness.
And the chapter ends with the basement, or not the basement, lower deck where they're the blubber room, and yeah, they're using these big spades to cut up the blubber on the floor, and toes are scarce among veteran blubber room men. It's like, oh my gosh. Oh, it's nice to live in Fargo. That's what I'll say.
I just, looking again at the thing that he tasted the one time, then he goes, he says, it tasted something as I should conceive a royal cutlet from the thigh of Louis de Gras. Might have tasted, supposing him to have been killed the first day after the venison season, and that particular venison season contemporary with an unusually fine vintage of the vineyards of Champagne. So it's like he's of course tied it into cannibalism again, and it's just so ridiculous.
Well, and wine-fed deer, right? I mean, wine-fed deer is effectively what he's saying there.
Well, but I think the thigh is of a guy called Louis de Gras as well. So like he's been eating venison.
Louis the Sixth, King of France, called Louis the Fat.
Okay, so he's been eating venison that either that is drunk or he also drank champagne, and then he's imagining eating the guy's leg.
Right, and this is more of that strange mixing that he's doing here. And yeah, right at the end, he's talking about, back to the dangers of what's going on. But I think he's effectively linking, his getting lost in his work with their getting lost in their work, and because they can't see quite what they're doing, right? and so they cut off their toes, sort of a thing. And so on the one hand, the contrast is I get lost in my work and I get euphoric, and the worst outcome is I'm squeezing other people's hands, right, while I'm, imagining how one I am with the universe or something completely insane, right? And then he's contrasting that at the end with like, yeah, in some jobs you just get so lost you cut off your toes. Like, what is happening here? It's pretty good. Or your toes get cut off by the person you're working with, which is even funnier. I'm like, oh, none of this is good.
And he leads into this chapter with the last line of the previous chapter, saying that, like, he actually compares this strangeness as a comparison to what happened to Pip as well. So it's like this is the other half of the insanity and the relativism that happened to Pip.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Oh, that's a really smart observation. Yeah, so you can become a relativist by getting lost in a large world, or you can become a relativist by getting too soaked up in the details. Oh, now it makes more sense. Thank you, Castle. Now it makes total sense, because that's the last part of the critique that was missing. Now I got it. Okay. Now this is why we do this. Yeah, Castle's smarter than I am. That's for sure. So yeah, no, now I see it. I see that would be the last end of that particular critique. I never would have done the critique that way, of course, which is why obviously I didn't even see it. That makes total sense that there's two versions of relativism, right? Lost in the big world and lost in the small world, roughly speaking. And again, this goes right back to the greater critique, the domicide. Like, you can get domicide by focusing in on the details, right? And that's more age of gnosis for me, right? Too much knowledge about something gets you lost.
And looks like you get lost differently. So like Pip went insane from the realization of his tininess, whereas like Ishmaelville here, just at least temporarily, becomes a really creepy, insufferable hippie. Let's just I'm gonna read this line. Come, let us squeeze hands all round. Nay, let us all squeeze ourselves into each other. Let us squeeze ourselves universally into the very milk and sperm of kindness. Okay.
Well, and that right there, I hate to say it. Oh, no, I don't. What am I saying? I love to say this. That's the critique of what people are now talking about with Neoplatonism right there. Like, this chapter is the critique of that whole system, right? And so the dualism's there, right? This idea that you can get lost in the large sea, or you can get lost in your work. And there's a critique of expertise as such, because the experts get so lost in what they're doing. Either they turn into crazy hippies, or they cut the damn toes off, right? Or they cut the toes off of the people that they're working with. And you could, and I think this is fair, although feel free to push back. You could say that is the problem that we're running into, that Jordan Peterson and others are talking about in science, right? The other scientific practitioners are cutting off the feet of their fellows, and that's causing the collapse of the academy. And so
obviously, because they have to delineate their science from one another. So of course you're going to cut each other's toes off.
They can't, right? And so they're cutting each other's toes off, without realizing it. And I think, see, Melville saw it all coming. Yes, and he's, he's invoked science like 60 billion times already. So I mean, this isn't a far leap on my part. I think, you could maybe assigning it to the academy might be a bridge too far, although I don't think so, since he's already invoked Harvard too. He's clearly seeing all this meaning crisis stuff come to the fore. Way back here in, was it 1851 or whenever this was written, and talk about prophetic, and yeah, it's so easy to miss all the patterns because they're all there. Although I suspect that when Jonathan Peugeot talks about medieval thinking, that like a lot of the people, will say in the upper caste, who understood, who were classically trained or something, who understood this stuff, would have seen it this way. They would have seen all those patterns and gone, well, of course, and taken it, we'll say, really seriously. it would be interesting to contrast. I think this is the dawn of the protection of land. So you've got Central Park. Central Park comes out of Boston, actually, haha, because New York sucks and always did and always will. Because the idea of having a space where people just go and gather on the weekends, basically, and this is only really for the wealthy, right? But they open it to everybody because they do want everybody to experience it. But like that's where Central Park comes from. It's Frederick Law Olmsted, and I lived a block from his former residence, by the way. Walked by it all the time. That whole thing, I think, is right around this time period, if memory serves. Although I could be off. So there is this struggle that we'll say the upper class is going through to provide things like museums for the public and preserves, right? Because right after this, you get the national park system in the United States, right? That's Teddy Roosevelt, if memory serves.
It was about 50 years after this, so.
Right, but like these ideas take time to unfold, right? Yeah. And that's the thing, right? Like just as the critique that I guess wasn't taken seriously enough, and we get the Great War, right? Like watch out, don't follow this crazy French guy who conquered the world.
Here's what I want to get to the bottom of is Melville narrates Pip's madness from the third person. He's on the outside looking into that, but he narrates Ishmael's madness from the first person. I don't know. Is it? I feel like there's something there, but I don't know what it is. It might be that it's safer to go crazy in the details because you can still just pull your head up and say, okay, I just need to relax and go for a walk. Whereas that other domicide will really take you out.
We need an actual person more familiar with literature from this time in general, because I actually suspect what's going on, and I just don't. I'm not anywhere near well read enough to understand any of this. Is that he's critiquing writing as such by playing with perspective and the narrator, right? Because I mean, this is why Castle's insight that it's actually Ishmaelville who writes the book is so good, right? Because you're never clear, not never, but it's often becomes unclear at random times, or seemingly random times, who the author is and who the narrator is simultaneously. That there's no reason, like you could write the book without doing any of that, or you could write the book with only switching the narrator and the author pretty easily. That's been done many times. I suspect before Melville, although again, I'm not well read enough to make that definitive statement. And so I wonder actually if this critique is actually about perspective and the need for hierarchy and the depth of that hierarchy, because all three of those things are being played with in the narration of the book, right? And because we have, I don't know if we have 2 or 3 narrators actually, and that may change later. So I'm a little resident to pick at this point. We're not far enough through the book actually, but we have at least 2 narrators, right? Or 2 narrative perspectives, or if you want to get super technical about garbage that doesn't mean anything, right? So we have at least 2 perspectives that are being narrated to us through the book, but actually it's probably 3 or 4, you know, or maybe it's 3 layers of perspectives or something. That might be a fairer way to think about it. And I think, you know, for me, I would, if that's going on, and I think you could make that case pretty easily. That's part of the critique, right? So the structure of the book, the structure of the writing is part of the critique. And I wouldn't have imagined such things were possible, except I'm very slowly and painfully reading Clockwork Orange. And in the beginning, the guy who does the preface for the book actually outlines everything that Burgess is doing. And I was like, Burgess is insane, and who would even catch these games that he's playing?
He cranked that book out in like 3 weeks.
For the purpose of earning money.
Yeah.
And subsequently, with the U.S. publishing of the book, he compromises the structure of the book, which is important to the book, for money, based on his fear that he won't get it otherwise. And then he does the same thing in the movie version. So he does it 3 times. He corrupts himself for money. Like, he corrupts his artistic endeavor for money. And the whole thing was done for money, like, explicitly. And I'm reading, I haven't read the book yet, right? I'm reading this huge, it's a huge preface, actually. And I'm like, well, this is, I don't need to read the book. This tells the whole story of why this is a horrible book, right? And then it just turns out there's 21 chapters because there's 7 ages of man. Is that Shakespeare or something? I forget who he said it was, because I haven't read Shakespeare either.
That'd be like a medieval thought.
Maybe,
And
but
then there would be a sacrament for each stage.
right.
So
So the structure of the Clockwork Orange is there. And I was like, see, if I didn't have this preface, that would go right over my head. I'd be like, 21, who cares? Like, is that, yeah, you'd probably link it to age of character or something. These games where there's messages, we'll say, for different classes or castes of people, are being played early on. I mean, people are calling it modernity. That's obviously the worst term ever. See, navigating patterns for why.
Dante was doing that as well. I mean, like, that's not new.
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, the idea of doing it literarily is new.
I have
Well,
a
he
question.
had 34 cantos in the Inferno, right? And 34 is just kind of an ugly number. And then 33 and 33, well, that gets you up to 100, and he does all of that multi-level, symbolic weaving. We were talking about that.
Biblical numerology that relates back to the religious tradition,
Okay, yeah.
not relating to this weird amorphous thing called literature, which I think is
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, that's
ultimately
obviously corrupted.
ultimately an invalid category, I would say. Actually, I'd love to make that case someday to someone who doesn't think so. That would be fun. And maybe I can't, but it'd be fun to try. And like, it's the self-reference. And so, and obviously Melville's maybe not doing that, right? Because this is so full of biblical reference that I don't even think you're getting them all, Father. No,
Entirely
no
possible.
offense.
Bible's a big book.
Yeah, and you have to know it pretty well. And you're a Catholic, and they don't really emphasize that quite so much.
We're getting better.
Rightly,
We're getting
rightly,
better.
rightly so. Participation's way more important than books that you could easily burn and be fine without. And I think that part of the way he's writing this is wrapped up in that structural critique that he keeps dipping into in these chapters in particular, that he keeps dipping into. And that's my suspicion about why he's switching the narrative perspective in that way. But I don't, we're well past anything that I have any good information on, much less understanding of, or heaven forfend knowledge of. I'm just not anywhere near there.
So I have a question. I was wondering if you guys think that, like, the cutting off of the toes, like, for these people that are basically in, like, the basement of the boat, if there can be such a thing, and then if that has any connection to the nonsensicalness of cutting off the tail for the purpose of giving to the queen, who actually should just be sharing in the head that is given to, or the headship with the king, because all the stuff that she needs is actually in the head, but they give the tail as well. That there's this sort of aspect of, like, the people at the bottom are, you got the whalemen who are on the beach, who basically get sliced off at the knees by the duke's representative, and then you have the whale, which is just cut in half, and then both halves are given anyway to the people who only need the one half. And then you've got these people who are down in the basement, who are, toes are scarce among them. And there's this kind of reference made to, like, why would you give the tail to the queen? Was she like some sort of mermaid or something? And so just this sort of connection to, like, tails and feet. I don't know. I'm kind of seeing that, plus the social commentary with the three layers.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a good point, right? Because, and I don't know, it's not clear to me in thinking about it, whether or not he's accounting for, we'll say, beauty correctly, right? He's not like, I don't know that he's addressing that sort of head on, which is why he, mermaids, and the piece of the whale that they use for their dresses and their corsets, right? Which is definitely a thing, by the way. Whalebone corsets are well known. You can go see them at museums and such not. But it's a good point, right? Like, again, this I think for him is part of the social critique of the disconnection between the head, the thing at the top, and the bottom, which happens as the result, and obviously Ludwig York here mentioned earlier, of the beheading of the English king, and right, that starts everything. Like, that just destroys the world. And you can argue it goes back even further. In fact, we did on Navigating Patterns. You can argue it goes all the way back to Henry VIII and his cutting off of the authority of the church from his dominion, and then subverting or subsuming the church under himself, right? And sort of like splitting that baby almost, which obviously just creates blood on the floor and nobody wins. And then that results in the beheading of the king, right? And then that's why the French Revolution, and like, yeah, it's all downhill from there, basically. Like, the Great War is inevitable at that point. And whether or not it's beheading of the king, and you could pull up, or it's Henry VIII's usurpation and then ransacking of the monasteries at the same time, which really does everything in. And so the collapse is inevitable at that point. It really doesn't matter. But I think you're right. I think, Castle, this is more of that. Back in the medieval times, it wouldn't have been this disconnected. You wouldn't have actually had that, because one way to read the earlier critique about the Duke taking the whale, at the layer of him saying, I've already paid them and it's none of your business, is to say, they already work for me. My grace has already been given unto them, right? I've already showered them with riches for living at the sea or something. And there's many ways that could have happened. Like, for example, back in the day, there was a special tax for the people that were on the coast for the war. So because they had the riches were coming in there. And so, all of this sort of plays into that. Like, well, they already have special treatment anyway because they're coastal. And so we have to take some of their bounty away and spread it out, and things like that. Like, there's all these weird, and that tax later gets usurped. So there's all these weird sort of relationships, but I do think you're right. What he's pointing at, as he's trying to highlight the critique of the feudal system of the medieval times, and it's not clear, right? Because I don't think he's making a statement one way or the other. That's why he keeps switching back and forth and all these things. It's not clear whether he thinks it's a good thing or a bad thing, and he's just pointing to it, which would be, in my opinion, the correct thing to do.
Well, I have an opinion, and I think the opinion is that this has been a fantastic discussion, but there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. So, appreciate both of you reading this, taking the time to discuss it. Appreciate your insights. Anybody who might listen to this, if you want more of this action, you want in on the action yourself, join the Discord server down below. But all I can say is watch out for whales, because this is a dangerous place out there.
Thank you, Father.